Powerful photo by Pacific Indigenous artist reveals truth about 1899 painting on an early morning. In 2008, before the Metropolitan Museum of Art opened for the day, the artist Yuki Kahara sat down across from two paintings by the French artist Paul Gauguin and inspected them in the hushed, empty gallery. The Japanese and Samoan artist, who was exhibiting at the New York Museum at the time, was particularly interested in Two Tahitian Women, from 1899, which features two feminine figures in an Eden-like setting. One holds a flower and leans into her companion, who presents a tray of fruit to the viewer, but doesn't quite look up to meet the eye. 14 years after first seeing it, Kahara has upcycled or reinterpreted the painting, along with many of Gauguin's other artworks, in a photography series titled Paradise Paradise. Camp for the Venice Biennale. It's not like reenactment or restaging, because when I say upcycling, it means that I'm actually improving it from the original, Kahara said in a video call. Kahara is the first Pacific Indigenous artist from Samoa's Fa'afafine community, who are assigned male at birth but express a female identity, to represent New Zealand at the prestigious global art show. In Paradise Camp, curated by Natalie King, Kahara intertwines themes of LGBTQ rights, environmentalism, and decolonization. In her lush images, taken on Upolu Island in Samoa with a nearly 100-person cast and crew, she casts Fa'afafine in the starring roles, keeping the familiarity of Gauguin's compositions but shedding his exploitative perspective. In modern art, Gauguin's colonial gaze of paradise has been formative. The painter, who died in 1903, spent a decade of his later life in French Polynesia exoticizing the young indigenous women he encountered through a prolific number of canvases, and had predatory relationships with them as well, a complicated legacy that was addressed in the exhibition. Gauguin Portraits at the National Gallery in London in 2019. The teenage girls he painted included a 13-year-old named Tahaamana Tahura, who experts believe to be his second wife, though her identity has been debated. Two Tahitian Women, from 1899, by Paul Gauguin. Paul Gauguin, courtesy Metropolitan Museum of Art, uncovering and upcycling how true are Gauguin's works and how much is constructed. To Kahara, the scenes, supposedly set in Tahiti, felt all too familiar. The closer I looked at the background, and then the closer I looked at the models, it reminded me of people and places in Samoa, she said. Through her extensive research of colonial photography, Kahara has found a clear link to the archipelago, specifically through the images of Thomas Andrew, a New Zealand photographer who lived in Samoa for the latter half of his life, from 1891 until 1939. Kahara discovered compositions identical to Gauguin's work, as well as evidence that Gauguin in 1895 visited the Auckland Art Gallery, where some of Andrew's images were housed. Although Gauguin has never actually set foot in Samoa, some of his major paintings were actually directly inspired by photographs of people and places there, she said. Kahara also believes that Gauguin's models may not be cisgender women, referencing the research of Maori scholar Dr. Nahuia Te Awekotuku, who has written that the androgynous models he painted were likely Mahu, the indigenous Polynesian community that, like Samoa's Fa'afafine, are considered to be a third gender and express a female identity. With these connections in mind, Kahara set out to improve upon Gauguin's famous works from a Pacific perspective. In her take on the painting Two Tahitian Women, called and quote. Tu Fa'afafine, after Gauguin, and quote. The two Fa'afafine models stand in front of the manicured gardens of a local resort wearing traditional textiles. Kahara chose to feature local wildflowers and a plate of rambutan as their props, creating an altogether new iconography. According to Kahara, her portrait challenges the very concept of paradise. And quote. The idea of paradise is actually heteronormative, and quote. She said, referencing the Bible's Garden of Eden, home to Adam and Eve. In famous literature and art, as well as commercial imagery of honeymooning newlyweds, and quote. Paradise has been perpetuated by many people, including Paul Gauguin, and quote. She said. And quote. He comes from a canon of the Western gaze that impose this idea. And quote. Calling a place paradise also glosses over the complexities of the seemingly idyllic regions where tourists travel to escape, she added, including the land's history of colonial violence and the looming threat of climate disaster, a battle in which Samoa is on the front lines. After the biennale concludes, Kahara plans to exhibit the work for her own community in Samoa, New Zealand and Australia. And quote. I'm taking the integrity and the dignity back to where it belongs to us, in the Pacific, and quote. She said.